An entire crowd, thousands of people, looked at Jesus Christ, the man who healed the blind, raised the dead, and fed the multitudes, and they screamed for his death. They chose Barabbas, a murderer, a criminal, a man with blood on his hands. How does that happen? How does an entire population turn against goodness itself? This was not random mob behavior. This was orchestrated manipulation. And here's what terrifies me. The same psychological forces that turned that crowd into executioners are operating right now today in your life. Fear, lies, crowds. These three forces have destroyed more souls than any army in history. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how mass deception works, and more importantly, whether you would have been any different standing in that crowd 2,000 years ago. The setup. Before we understand the choice, we need to understand the setup. This wasn't a spontaneous moment. The religious leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees, had been preparing for this day for months. They feared Jesus, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. His teachings were exposing their hypocrisy. Their power was built on controlling people's access to God, and Jesus was giving that access away for free. They loved the praise of men more than the praise of God, so they planted seeds of doubt. They spread rumors. They questioned his authority publicly while plotting his death privately. By the time that Passover arrived, the crowd had been primed. They didn't know they were being manipulated. That's what makes manipulation so effective. The people thought they were thinking for themselves. They weren't. They were thinking what they had been conditioned to think. Sound familiar? Every dictator, every corrupt system, every mass movement that turned evil. It started with people who believed they were making their own choices. But what comes next reveals the first weapon of mass deception. Weapon of fear. The first weapon is always fear. The religious leaders told the people that Jesus was dangerous. He was a threat to their nation, their traditions, their way of life. If Rome thought the Jews were following a new king, they would crush them. Fear makes you see enemies everywhere. The Pharisees weaponized this perfectly. They made the crowd afraid of what would happen if Jesus lived, not what would happen if he died. This is the psychology of fear. It narrows your vision. When you're afraid, you can only see the immediate threat, not the long-term consequences. The crowd couldn't see that they were condemning the Messiah. They could only see the danger the leaders had planted in their minds. Today, we think we're too sophisticated for this, but fear still controls more decision than logic ever will. If this pattern is resonating in your spirit, hit like and subscribe for more teachings that reveal hidden truths, because what comes next explains why intelligent people make catastrophic choices. Fear makes us choose safety over truth, comfort over conviction, the crowd over our conscience. The power of lies. The second weapon is repeated lies. The leaders didn't just tell one lie, they told many over and over. Jesus was a blasphemer. He broke the Sabbath. He claimed to be God. He was dangerous. He was deceived. He was a fraud. Repeat a lie enough, and eventually it starts to feel like truth. This is what psychologists call the illusory truth effect. When you hear something multiple times, your brain begins to process it as familiar, and familiar feels true. The crowd had heard these accusations about Jesus so many times that by Passover, they felt obvious. Of course he was dangerous. Everyone knew it. But here's the devastating reality. Not one person in that crowd had verified these claims for themselves. They hadn't sat at his feet. They hadn't witnessed his compassion firsthand. They had outsourced their discernment to authorities who had an agenda. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus said truth sets you free. But the crowd had embraced lies, and those lies put them in chains. And speaking of chains, what comes next reveals why people willingly bind themselves. Crowd contagion. The third weapon is the crowd itself. There's a phenomenon called social contagion. Emotions spread through groups like wildfire. One person shouts, "Crucify him," and suddenly the energy shifts. Others join in. The volume increases. Within seconds, individual conscience dissolves into collective madness. Contagion. The psychologist Gustave Le Bon studied this in the 19th century. He discovered that when people enter a crowd, they experience a kind of hypnosis. Their individual identity fades. They become part of something larger, and that something can be manipulated. The religious leaders knew this. They planted people in the crowd to start the chanting. Once the wave began, it was unstoppable. And here's what haunts me. There were probably people in that crowd who days earlier had praised Jesus, who had been healed by him, who had eaten the bread he multiplied. But in that moment, surrounded by the screaming mob, they couldn't remember. They could only feel the pressure to conform. The crowd doesn't think it feels, but this leads us to something even more disturbing about why Pilate's offer backfired. Pilate's gamble. Pilate thought he was clever. He gave the crowd a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. Surely they would choose the miracle worker over the murderer. This was his way out. He could release Jesus without taking responsibility. But Pilate miscalculated. He didn't understand that the choice was never really free. The crowd had already been programmed. The religious leaders had done their work. What shall I do then with Jesus who is called Christ? When Pilate asked that question, he expected deliberation. He got a roar, crucify him. The speed of their response reveals the depth of their manipulation. There was no pause, no consideration, no individual wrestling with conscience. Just instant, unified rejection. Pilate washed his hands, but the stain never came off. He tried to escape responsibility through a democratic process, not realizing that democracy means nothing when the voters have been deceived. Justice contaminated by lies produces only more injustice. But wait, because what comes next changes everything about how we see Barabbas. The Barabbas mirror. Here's something most people miss. Barabbas wasn't just any criminal. His name, Barabbas, literally means son of the Father. Son of the Father. Think about that. The crowd chose a false son of the Father over the true son of the Father. They chose a counterfeit over the authentic, a murderer over the life-giver. This is the pattern of human deception throughout history. We consistently choose the cheap imitation because it requires less of us. Barabbas represented violent revolution, change through force, immediate results, blood in the streets. Jesus represented transformation from within, patient love, sacrificial service, eternal change. The crowd wanted quick solutions. They wanted their problems solved by someone else's violence. They didn't want the slow, difficult work of having their own hearts transformed. We always want Barabbas until we realize he cannot save us. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Would you be different? Would you have been different? It's easy to say yes from 2,000 years away, but be honest with yourself. Have you ever gone along with a crowd even when something felt wrong? Have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken? Have you ever accepted information without verifying it yourself? The forces that moved that crowd are the same forces moving through society today. Social media algorithms show you what confirms your existing beliefs. News outlets tell you what to fear. Political leaders identify enemies for you to hate. And the crowd, the digital mob, is always ready to crucify whoever the algorithm targets next. You are being manipulated right now, and you don't even know it. The only difference between you and that ancient crowd is the technology. The psychology is identical: fear, repeated lies, social pressure. These are the weapons of mass deception in every age. But there's a reason Jesus stood alone that day, and understanding it changes everything. Jesus stood alone. Jesus knew what was coming. He could have convinced the crowd. He could have performed a miracle right there. He could have called down legions of angels, but he stood silent. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Why? Because Jesus understood something the crowd didn't. You cannot argue with manipulation. You cannot reason with mass hysteria. The only response to collective madness is individual conviction. Jesus was demonstrating what it looks like to refuse the crowd, to stand in truth even when everyone around you has chosen the lie, to maintain your identity when the mob demands you surrender it. Conviction. This is the model for us. Not clever arguments, not fighting manipulation with more manipulation, just quiet, unshakable truth. The crowd chose Barabbas. Jesus chose the cross, and in that choice he showed us the only path through mass deception, the willingness to stand alone. But this brings us to the redemption hidden in this dark story, the hidden grace. Here's the beautiful irony the crowd couldn't see. By choosing Barabbas, they were actually fulfilling God's plan. Jesus came to die. The cross was the destination all along. Their evil became his victory. The manipulated crowd thought they were defeating Jesus. They were actually participating in the salvation of the world. Barabbas walked free that day, a guilty man released because an innocent man took his place. That's the gospel in one scene. We are all Barabbas. We are all guilty. We all deserve judgment. But Jesus took our place. The crowd's worst decision became humanity's greatest gift. God's sovereignty doesn't excuse human evil, but it does transform it. What the religious leaders meant for destruction, God used for redemption. Even mass deception cannot stop divine purpose. This should give us hope. The same God who redeemed that dark day can redeem our compromises, our moments of cowardice, our times when we went along with the crowd. Your choice today. Every day you face the same choice that crowd faced. Not about Jesus literally, but about truth versus lies, conviction versus conformity, individual conscience versus collective pressure. 1. Question what the crowd believes. 2. Verify before you accept. 3. Stand alone when truth demands it. 4. Remember that fear is a weapon against you. 5. Choose transformation over quick solutions. The religious leaders of our age are still operating. They still use fear. They still repeat lies until they feel true. They still weaponize crowds against anyone who threatens their power. The question is, will you be part of the mob or will you stand with Jesus? The same spirit that raised Christ from the dead lives in you. You have the power to resist mass deception. You have the authority to think for yourself. You have the calling to stand for truth even when everyone around you is screaming for Barabbas. The crowd chose poorly that day, but you don't have to. 2,000 years ago, a manipulated crowd made the worst choice in human history. They had been primed by fear, poisoned by lies, and swept up in collective madness. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus forgave them because they were deceived. But you now know how deception works. You've seen the pattern. Fear narrows your vision. Repeated lies feel like truth. Crowds dissolve individual conscience. These weapons are ancient and they're still being used against you today. Choose truth, stand alone. The next time you feel the pressure to go along with the crowd, remember that crowd in Jerusalem. Remember that they were absolutely certain they were right. Remember that certainty is not the same as truth. Jesus stood alone against the collective madness of his age. He's calling you to do the same in yours. If you made it this far, comment, "I choose Jesus," to declare that you won't be part of the mob. Stay in the Word, stay in the Spirit, and watch what God does. If this opened your eyes, like and subscribe for more truth that sets you free. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.